and then start the slideshow. All right, does this look how it's supposed to look?
Yes, it's on the show.
Thank you so much. And as I said, Turo, thanks for the kind introduction. It is a great pleasure to have so many colleagues from around the world that I have been working with for decades and who we've been able to grow our careers together and make our contributions. So thank you very much to my hosts and to all of you here for your kind attention. So I'm going to talk in general about two linked research projects. And the National Transfer Accounts Project, that's the logo there, is about understanding the generational economy. And the Counting Women's Work project was sort of born out of the NTA project in order to add a gender lens to that whole line of research understanding the generational economy. So the generational and gendered economy. And I sort of over prepared slides, so I might skip some things so that we have some time to discuss at the end. My objectives are to introduce the concept of the generational economy and how we measure it using the National Transfer Accounts method, and to show how it can help us plan to cope with changing population dynamics. So where to find those opportunities in adapting to future change. And then to highlight the importance also of understanding the gender dimension in the generational economy. And that's through a linked methodology we call the National Time Transfer Accounts. So to start with the generational economy and national transfer accounts, I will just can way back. And this is just a chart of total GDP across the world. And it's usually, often when we talk about economies in cross-national perspective, we're often talking about just GDP, an aggregate for each country. So these are from a research hub called Our World in Data, which gathers research on a lot of different topics. It's really a wonderful resource. If you haven't looked at that, there's all sorts of demographic, economic, social topics. So this GDP chart is an example of national accounts data. National accounts are an accounting system to measure certain economic aggregates. They were developed in the aftermath of the Great Depression, so that the idea was we would be able to understand our economies if we measured them. But of course, if you're trying to understand the well-being of actual people, you want to focus on per capita GDP instead of total GDP. So the picture changes somewhat when you look at the per capita numbers. The adjustment for comparability is also different in this chart. But so to go from aggregate to per capita, we're trying to get closer to the experience of actual people. But we also know that this per capita idea is a fiction as well. There's no average person. There's no actual person who is the average person in all things in a country. So we want to break this down further into more characteristics. So I am a demographer, and I come from research traditions in economic demography. So what demographers want to know the most about is age. Also sex, we'll incorporate that later. But this is where the concept of the generational economy comes into play. These single national averages, we want to disaggregate them by age, so that we can understand the age dimension of our economies. Of course, there are many other dimensions of our economies that are relevant in addition to age: urban and rural divisions, particular sub-geographies, say districts or regions, any particular race, ethnic distribution within a particular country. Those characteristics are also important and can be added on to the framework once we have the generational economy estimates. So what you're looking at here is what we call age profiles in the National Transfer Accounts Project. They're smoothed estimates of average flows by age. This particular example shows averages across different groups of countries. The light gray dots are for higher income countries. The black dots are for lower income countries. And for two different kinds of national aggregates, labor income on the top. So that includes income from wage work. It includes any fringe benefits that accrue to wage workers, and also a portion of self-employment income. So it's considered the income earned from labor. And then down at the bottom is total consumption. And that includes both private consumption, things like what we pay for food, clothing, shelter, entertainment, etc. But then also public consumption. So when the government provides us consumer goods, say healthcare or education, and also a sort of share of the overall services that the public sector is providing. So what we see here about the generational economy, particularly in labor income, is the variability over the life cycle. So the reason we're interested in the generational economy is that age is one of the most important variables to tell us about someone's economic life. Most other characteristics that we could think about, say region or ethnic group, the degree to which the labor income of those groups vary is very small compared to the difference between the labor income of a child versus a prime age adult. Consumption is certainly more consistent over the life course compared to labor income, doesn't vary as much, but it does have distinct age profiles, lower for younger age groups, higher for older age groups. However, that gradient is much higher in higher income countries, mostly due to greater healthcare spending. So putting these two charts together shows us which ages have a life cycle deficit, so those ages where they are consuming more than they're producing, and then which age groups have a life cycle surplus, where they are producing more than they're consuming. So age groups with deficits have to get resources from age groups with a surplus. So we used to refer to this in the National Transfer Accounts Project as the most important graph in the world, because really it is a fundamental aspect of social organization that all societies have to figure out how to satisfy these needs. Now, in most societies, most every society, a large amount of the resources going to children comes from their families, from their parents, but also some of it comes from the public sector through publicly provided education and healthcare. Now, the life cycle deficit at older ages has a sort of more diverse set of solutions, and I'm putting some air quotes up there, for this deficit problem. So older persons often also in many countries receive public sector assistance through old age pensions, or healthcare that is provided to older persons, but they also use assets that they've accumulated through their lifetime, so that they were saving during those peak working years so that they could consume either the income that accrues to that savings, or to spend down that accumulated savings itself in order to support consumption in old age. Now, there are also family transfers to older people, but one of the things that the National Transfer Accounts Project has shown us is that that is actually relatively small in terms of how older persons around the world are solving this life cycle deficit problem. Only in a few East Asian countries do we find actually any sizable net transfers going from adult children to elderly parents. Now, those flows, as I mentioned, are mediated through institutions, and those institutions are families, governments, and markets. And the flows can be in the form of transfers, those family transfers or public transfers, or asset-based reallocations. So when you go into debt in order to consume today what you don't have, and then you pay it back tomorrow, or you save today and then spend tomorrow, or consume tomorrow, excuse me. So this economic life cycle, the age patterning of when you have a surplus and when you have a deficit is key to understanding the economic impact of population. So that's sort of a core economic demography aspect. And in NTA, we talk about that as the generational economy. So we define that as the social institutions and economic mechanisms used by each generation or age group to produce, consume, share, and save resources. And then the economic flows that I was just speaking about that go from one age group to another. And then explicit and implicit contracts that govern the intergenerational flows. And then finally, the intergenerational distribution after all of those transfers and asset based reallocations are used. So, how does that end up in what people have to spend for their own consumption? In NTA, we sort of categorize, starting from the way National Accounts thinks about these, we sort of categorize them in different ways in order to highlight this aspect of the generational economy. So there are resources that you have from labor earnings, from asset income, government transfers in which you receive benefits, or family transfers in which you receive resources from family members or other private sources. And then all of those resources are used for either consumption or saving, government transfers, which is paying taxes, or family transfers, where you support other members of your family. And so you can see that there are sort of different levels of those institutional mechanisms. Here we have markets. Here we have government, public sector, families as institutions, mediating the difference between labor earning and consumption. So I can sort of rearrange this into that sort of life cycle deficit on this side. So the consumption less labor income. And then here we have, again, the solution, air quotes, to that life cycle deficit. Either I'm using asset-based reallocation, so asset income minus what I save, or net transfers, what I receive from people less what I give. And so these are all pieces in the NTA flow equation that we try to estimate for national economies by age. Pardon? Voice is going. So national accounts give aggregate flows adjusted for some NTA specific concepts. So in NTA, we start with national accounting, and then we use household survey data and administrative data to pull those aggregates apart. So for example, I have from a labor force survey, a sample of information on how much people earned. And from the survey, I also know their age. So I can get relative shares of total labor income in the sample, and then use that to disaggregate what my national accounts tells me that total labor income in the country was for a particular period. So in NTA, we focus on the individual. So in a lot of economic demography or economic studies of well-being, people focus on households. So NTA is different. Focused on economic demography as is, it's focused on the individual, because the individual is the one that has an age and a sex that we can measure and that we're interested in, not the household. So we also then consider that all resources of, say, government institutions or corporations or other institutions in the society are just representing interests of individuals. So interests of taxpayers, interest of owners of corporations. Now, private transfers, where we figure out how much people are giving to individual household members, family members, that's a flow that does not appear in national accounts. Instead, that is an NTA idea, and it comes from measuring all of the other flows and then sort of backing out what the transfers have to be in order for different household members to be able to consume as we see them consuming. And then finally, we get private saving as a final balancing item. So the NTA data requirements overall are national accounts. I need household income and expenditure surveys. So for instance, labor force surveys, expenditure surveys, living standard surveys, things like that. And then I need administrative data. So public records data of public programs, things that would not possibly be included in a survey, like how much public education was costing, things like that. And then finally, I need population estimates and projections in order to make sure that my averages by age, when I multiply them by the total population by age, nets up to agree with the national accounts amounts. So once I have these estimates, so I've taken my national account data, I've pulled them apart, I've inferred how much private transfers family members have to be making to one another to support their consumption. How can I use that to understand how population change will affect things I care about, like economic growth? So the next discussion is really sort of going over the results from a paper that was published by the National Transfer Accounts Network at the end of 2021. And I completely borrowed a bunch of slides from Andrew Mason, who is a former professor of Touros at the University of Hawaii and East West Center, because he was the main author of that. So one of the results in that paper focuses on demographic dividends. So demographic dividends, often you'll hear discussed as first dividends and second dividends. So the first dividend is about the growth in the effective number of workers per the effective number of consumers. So in the NTA conception, what that means is that I take my labor income that's representing the effective workers and multiply that by population counts by age, and then divide that by the same sort of calculation done for consumption. So my age profiles give me the individual levels, and then I multiply that by my population estimates. And they over time, as population changes, the numbers in each age group change, the ratio of that labor income to consumption will change. Now, when we go through the demographic transition from high fertility to high mortality down to low fertility and low mortality, we go through a transitory stage where there are relatively more workers year after year than there are consumers. So, and defining workers versus consumers as age groups that have a surplus of labor income over their own consumption versus age groups that have a deficit of labor income relative to consumption. And so that's a much more specific way to define dependency rather than just age group ratios, which you see very often in the literature. Now, this first dividend that comes from just the demographic transition, changing population age structure, is transitory. It's a transitory change in the population that favors productivity over consumption. It's transitory unless that increased production is invested to enhance future growth. Now, luckily, we also can theorize and estimate a second dividend. So the second dividend is about the fact that continuing on through the demographic transition, our age structure continues to change to be an older society. And while an older society may not favor production as much as that transitory big bulge in producers, it does favor age groups who have been able to accumulate more capital. So when we look at accumulated wealth, it often has quite a large skew to older age groups. So As the population continues to age, the age structure changes to favor capital deepening, more capital available to invest in the labor force, and human capital investment as well. And so all of this can increase productivity and thus increase consumption per effective worker. So in the paper that I was discussing, the first demographic dividend was shown to have contributed to higher standards of living around the world. Largest gain, and so this is from 1960 to 2020, showing what that first dividend looked like. So this is in Europe and North America. It sort of peaked and then it went down as those populations aged and left their sort of first dividend phase behind. That worker bulge gets left behind. Eastern Asia has a sort of similar but more extreme pattern. Latin America is from 2020 is only just barely beginning to get down to the end of that phase. Southern Asia, similarly, but less extreme compared to Latin America. And then Sub-Saharan Africa is just entering its demographic dividend phase on average across all those countries, although there is diversity in the countries in population age structure and in the shape of their generational economies. So as we continue to sort of project our populations, we can see the changes that it's going to continue to be negative in Europe and North America, Asia as well, quite extremely. Mostly that shows the rapid transition to an aging society in China, and then sort of different patterns through the rest of the population. Now, you can do this same type of analysis, so comparing what age structure does to the relative shares of producers versus consumers, but in the fiscal space. So instead of comparing producers or labor income to consumers' consumption, I can compare age profiles of taxpayers to public beneficiaries, to people who are benefiting from public programs. And by the same token, see how age structure changes are making it harder or easier to support the kind of public spending that I want to have in my country. So I'm going to skip through some of this stuff because I want to get to other parts and not take too much time on this. So here's this paper that came out in Population and Development Review that I've been talking about. Oh, it was published this year. But so overall, what we can see, and this is using NTA data to figure out how much of the change in global GDP growth was due to weighted effective labor. So that's sort of the just population compositional change effect versus productivity growth. So the productivity of individuals versus the change in types of individuals by age in your population. So from 1950 to 75, that was mostly productivity growth, but a decent chunk for the labor force growth. 1975 to 2000, labor force growth is the bit larger share. That decreases to 2020 and is projected to be quite small in the future. So we're expecting to see economic growth have a very different cast, and we are going to have to figure out ways to achieve it from productivity growth because population growth is not expected to be providing that same push that it has in the past. Okay, so another thing that we can see through national transfer accounts are other ways in which population has changed our economies. It's transformed reproduction and human capital investment. So lower fertility increased opportunities for women because they are able to redirect time and energy to productive activities other than childbearing and child raising. So education, production of market goods and services, or say perhaps they've been using the same amount of time, but more intensively for each child. So each child gets more time, which, depending on who you ask, can either represent an increase in human capital investment in those children, or overbearing helicopter parents that drive their kids crazy and probably don't make them any more productive, or maybe even less so. This is an open question, and I think an interesting sort of research area. So then there's another aspect of this lowered fertility. Small families are investing more per child in human capital. So that is a market good in services, not just time spent with children. So health, education, and public and private. And we can see this when we use NTA data to look at average human capital spending. So that's how much on average people in these different countries are investing in children's health and public education compared to the total fertility rates. So what we see is a sort of curvilinear pattern here that, if we exponentiated this, would look like a pretty straight trade-off. So it looks like people are sort of investing a set chunk of their own productivity in their children, and the more they have, the less each one gets. The fewer they have, the more each one gets. Overall, what does this mean for policy in an aging world? So we definitely need strategies for increasing our resources rather than just increasing our labor force, which we have been able to do for past quite a few decades. So the quantity of labor can be increased without needing additional humans by delaying retirement or in lowering gender gaps in the labor force. So or greater investment in human capital makes each particular worker potentially more productive. Improvements in capital and labor markets to use those resources more efficiently, and then cost reducing innovation for consumer goods like healthcare, which are going to be harder to provide for older populations at the same level that we have in recent past. Or we can also look to reform reallocation systems, transfer systems that are more in balance with population to be sustainable. So perhaps pension systems cannot be as generous in the future as they have been in the past. Or asset-based systems, say pre-funded retirement accounts, or encouraging more own saving for retirement, can be part of retirement to support and enhance an opportunity for a second demographic dividend. So now I'd like to move on to discussing adding a gender lens to our picture of the generational economy. So what we had looked at before were single sex estimates. So this is the United States for my country recent year, a per capita NTA age profiles for consumption and labor income, same thing I was showing before. And then the difference between them is the life cycle deficit. So when I pull these lines apart by sex, what I get are for females, the dotted lines, and males are the solid lines. So consumption in the US and in most of the other countries that we have done this for are not all that different, but labor income is quite different. And we can see that the red lines barely touch the female labor income curve, meaning that there's hardly any surplus generated on average at any age group for women, for females. Now, as I should stress, this is on average. Plenty of women in the United States are actually earning more than they are consuming, but on average, this is the picture that we get. So, and I'll talk more about sort of why this picture looks the way it is in just a moment. But first, just to discuss some applications of these NTA age profiles pulled apart for male and female. So they can help us understand gender in the labor market. So they can help us get a very clear picture of those gender gaps. And the NTA labor income profile by sex rolls up all of the differences in labor markets by sex. So that's labor force participation, that's different levels of education, receiving different remuneration in the labor market, That's occupational segregation, different full-time, part-time, and then sort of after all those participation aspects, then we finally get to sort of different wages for same work, which in a certain context is still quite an issue. So NTA bisex can be a framework for examining gender pay gaps. We can also ask, can women's labor ameliorate the impacts of population aging? So in the previous look at what NTA is often used for, it's used to see how far out of whack our production needs are going to be from our consumption needs when our populations get much older. So it's natural to ask, say, women who are having lower labor market participation, if we eliminate that gap, can that sort of help us solve this aging problem to some extent? So, and you can also, we haven't really stressed this very much in the NTA project, but you can also kind of take a gender budgeting lens to NTAs and look at the gender ramifications for current tax and benefit policies. So bisex, who is paying the taxes, who is receiving the benefits, and then asset income and savings. So who has access to asset income, who is receiving that, who has access to capital markets by gender. Those are other important questions that we can examine with sex-specific NTAs. And then finally, consumption. So as I mentioned, we haven't really seen a huge gaps by consumption in most contexts, but there certainly could be some, and we can certainly work on developing better tools to see that. Only looking at this previous picture I showed you, we can also think that something's missing here. So let's go see what's missing. So there's a serious limitation to the NTA method because it's based on national accounts. And we know that work is measured in national accounts isn't the only work that people do. There's more to production than just market production. So what this picture shows you, and this comes from time use surveys, is the average hour per week. And this is across an average across 18 different countries, diverse in region, diverse in level of socioeconomic development, level of income. But these average patterns are pretty consistent, that while there's a great amount of time spent in our population on market work, and this is in hours per week, there's also a great amount of time spent in our economies on unpaid care work. And that includes two main types of work. One is direct care for persons. So when you take care of children or sick or disabled adults or elders, that's unpaid direct care, unpaid care work. It also includes indirect care through housework. So that's cooking, cleaning, household maintenance and management, all of the unpaid tasks that maintain our household and maintain living standards and really sort of maintain our ability to be productive members of society and maintain well-being. So while during the peak working years, on average, that unpaid care work amount is less, it's greater for younger people on average, and it's also greater than market work on average for older persons. Now, this is pretty tiny. I'm hoping that you can all see this all right. So this is time spent in market work by men in the dashed lines and women in the solid lines in a diverse group of 18 countries. And then this is the time spent in unpaid care work in those same countries. So these are smooth schedules of hours per week spent on those two types of work. So one thing that we can see is that in every single country, the time spent in market work is more for men. In every single country, the time spent in unpaid care work is more for women. And for the gender that's specializing in that type of work, the magnitudes are roughly the same. So the y-axis ranges are the same on all of these charts. And so the magnitude of time spent on these two types of activities is roughly similar. One other thing I think that it's sort of important to notice is that these gaps exist as young as we measure time use. In these most of these populations, you can see it's sort of 0 up to age 15 or 10, depending on the survey instrument used. But those specialization in unpaid care work versus market work happen at very young ages. In market work, there are often early ages that are quite similar. But over in unpaid care work, only Vietnam really shows a decent number of young age groups where there are similar levels of unpaid care work being done in the household. So I think this is really shows how human capital is being shaped in a very gender specific way. So that's this, excuse me, is part of the institutional setting of our gendered economies. So, what does this specialization mean for how we understand economics, how we understand productivity, and what our gendered economy looks like? So, measurement matters. Women specialize, and so this 2 by 2 table asks what types of either goods or services that are either sold through markets or not sold through markets are included in national accounts. So goods, whether they are market or non-market goods, and so market goods is pretty obvious, things bought and sold in markets. Non-market goods are goods that are created by households by and large for their own use. So when I engage in subsistence agriculture and use that food to feed my family, that's a non-market good. Also, if I own a house and that house is providing, oh wait, sorry, no, that's a start. The house is providing me a good, which is housing, but I don't have to pay myself rent every time I use my own house. Then that's also sort of imputed, guessed at in national accounts. And market services, because they are bought and sold in markets, are also included in national accounts. So this piece, services that are produced by households for their own use, is not included in national accounts. And that is that unpaid care work piece that we were looking at in the previous set of charts. So in the national transfer accounts, we want to add this piece in so that we can understand the work that everyone is doing and the consumption that everyone has as well of all of those services. So we develop national time transfer accounts to include this piece into our picture of the generational economy. Now, we've started this work over a decade ago, as many other people were also making this argument that this invisible piece is really important to include in our picture of the economy. And now new policies from the International Labor Organization, the United Nations, and other agencies that sort of engage in economic measurement and sort of policy making around what is included in our economic data are also addressing the shortcoming of measures like GDP and trying to include these non-market services. They're also addressing shortcomings of GDP, not including environmental services, things like the services the climate provides, the services that soil provides, things like that. So it's another kind of shortcoming and piece left out of a measure like the gross domestic product. So national time transfer accounts were developed by the Counting Women's Work Project, which is a project within the National Transfer Accounts Network. It starts with a long-standing research methodology in sociology and social science called household production satellite accounts. So that methodology starts with time use surveys that tell us how much time people spend on unpaid care work, both that direct care and indirect care that I was discussing before, and then value that time by some imputed market wage. And there are different ways to impute a wage to this kind of time. We use the specialist replacement method. So that means for each type of unpaid care work, We want to find a market wage for that activity and value the unpaid care work time as that market wage to guess at its economic value. Then we take this existing methodology, household production satellite accounting, and apply our NTA framework, which disaggregates by age and also imputes the consumption and transfers. So we want to know not just who is producing unpaid care work, but who's consuming it. And I'll show you a bit what that picture looks like. So here again is that US picture of market work, labor income and consumption, or sorry, labor income for men, labor income for women, and then consumption, they're both pretty similar. And then here is my unpaid care work piece. So that's the national time transfer account estimate for the United States. So women are doing quite a bit more of this than men. That's that red solid line. Men are still doing a lot of it, but less. And then the consumption of this unpaid care work time looks very different than the age pattern of consumption of market goods and services. So children are the biggest consumers of this unpaid care work time, and older people are too. So when I put these two types of work and consumption together, I get a picture that looks very different than if I only look at the market work piece. I get a picture that makes the two genders look much more similar in their total productive capacity. And I get a consumption profile that makes children look more costly than they do if I'm only considering their market goods and services. Both types of work produce value, although measuring unpaid care work in terms of a wage is sort of a poor measure of its value. This is a guess, and often because the imputed wages for this unpaid care work tend to be very low wages, things like childcare worker wages are often very low compared to other occupations. This should, I think, be considered a floor, a sort of lower bound estimate of the value of those services. So the gendered economy, just like the generational economy, is about the patterns of difference, but in this case by gender. It also includes the gendered impacts of excluding unpaid care work that women are specializing in from traditional economic measurement theory and modeling. So why should we care about this? Well, because of a lot of things that the generational and gendered economies are changing. And we want to understand if we're allocating resources in an equitable and efficient way while all of this stuff is changing. And the fact that the gendered and generational economy affects outcomes that we care about, economic growth and well-being. Okay, so I have some sort of more picky methodology things that I'm going to skip over, just to show you sort of what we've learned from the national time transfer accounts so far. So to begin, we've learned that the time transfer accounts are large in terms of productive time. This shows an aggregate for a diverse group of countries, the total work hours distributed between unpaid care in red and market work in blue. So from the highest share for unpaid care work at about 60% in Spain, down to the lowest share for unpaid care work, that's about 30% in Thailand, it's still an enormous amount of total productive effort. And honestly, there are also some people who want to include reproductive effort in this, sort of how the effort of actually gestating and then say breastfeeding and things like that are also contributing to overall productivity. So that's another piece that we're leaving out here. Let's see, let me just make sure. All right. Okay, so another thing that we've learned is that it is large in terms of economic value. So here for a diverse group of countries, sorry, I should have written those out like I did on the other slide, but this is the aggregate unpaid care work. So the total unpaid care work valued at the imputed specialist wage relative to gross domestic product. So we have countries like Germany and Italy, where they have very high sort of legal minimum wages. Now, plenty of people are actually working for less than that in sort of this gray economy, but if we assume that those legal minimum wages are kind of actually in practice, we get over 50% value for the aggregate unpaid care work relative to GDP. And then at lower amounts, this is for Ghana, we get about 12% here relative to the market GDP. So that's still and those are going to be very low imputed wages, but it's still a big chunk of total value. Having mouse here. Okay. So the next thing about that we've learned from the time transfer accounts is that most of this unpaid care work is unpaid. So there is plenty of, of course, unpaid care work is unpaid, but I mean, looking at the care economy as some of it actually is in the paid care sector, and then some of it is unpaid care work. So for 2 countries, we've just started doing this, but for the United States and Korea, these bars at the top show the total time spent in caring occupation, so paid care work. The green is for highly credentialed workers such as teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers, etc. And then the small sliver in red is less credentialed, say home health aides, child care workers, care workers in the paid economy, but who do not have quite as high sort of licensing and educational requirements as those in green. But the biggest chunk is the total amount of time spent on unpaid care work. So while these 2 advanced economies you can buy a lot of care services in the market, it's nowhere near as much care is still being done on an unpaid basis. So most of the unpaid care work is being done by women. This chart shows for a large set of diverse countries, the proportion of men's in blue and women's in red time in providing care and housework. So the shares of who's providing the total unpaid care work time. So in all of these countries, women are providing the majority. In Senegal, over 90%, but even down here in very gender egalitarian Denmark, it's 70%. So now, sorry, I had some other notes on that. Okay. So another thing that we learned from national time transfer accounts is that unpaid care work creates the future, and it really changes the relative dependency of young and old compared to just looking at dependency in the market economy. So the cost of a child's first year, then, so this donut is 100%, 10% of all of that is market goods and services. And this is an average across, I think, 22 countries. 10% spent on market goods and services. So buying healthcare, buying little shoes, buying diapers for children is 10% of what we spend on a child's first year. Unpaid care work is the other 90%. And that is taking unpaid care time and valuing it at what are often very low child care wages. So this is not an opportunity cost argument about sort of the cost of opportunity cost to people who are doing this work. It's about if I just take an average childcare wage and then value the time spent on a newborn at that wage. So if we are just thinking about the cost of children in terms of market goods and services, we're missing a tremendous amount of what we spend on children. More on the dependency issue. So going back to our concept of the life cycle deficit, so the degree to which you consume above what you produce, either through your own unpaid care production or your labor income. For children age 0, 37% of that life cycle deficit, and this is different than the 10% because it's a different group of countries, but 37% for market goods and services, 63% for unpaid care work time. Now, for older people, this is a very different story. So this is age 90 plus for a group of countries. So only 10% of that is unpaid care time. Now, this is surprising to me because many of us think about population aging in the context of a sort of great wave of needing to provide unpaid care time to elderly persons. But the truth is that elderly persons are actually providing a great deal of unpaid care time for themselves or to each other, say to a spouse or to another household member. So, in terms of thinking about who is really expensive, it's children who are expensive in the unpaid care work economy, even while on average, it's often older persons who are more expensive in market goods and service economy. So this one, so we have more time. So what do these findings all mean for policy? So policies to increase labor force participation must recognize the work that people are already doing. So in confronting population aging issues, we often say, well, we have to have people work longer and we have to reduce gender gaps in labor force participation. But what we saw in looking at national time transfer accounts is that women are already doing a great deal of work caring for families. Older persons are doing a great deal of work caring for grandchildren, and grown children are caring for elders. So that work has to be included in any policies to increase labor force participation, or those policies won't work, or they'll actually decrease well-being overall. The invisibility of women's work, and put that in quotes because everyone does this work. It's just that women do more of it on average than men in most societies. But the invisibility can lead to policy mistakes. So I think the COVID pandemic is a pretty good example of this, that none of our pandemic planning really included the fact that schools might shut down completely for months on end. So we were not ready for that at all, and that caused a great deal of hardship in households and to kids. Demographic dividend modeling should also include unpaid care work. And then underinvestment in infrastructure that increases unpaid care work productivity may be occurring because we don't count the unpaid care work productivity that, say, better transportation systems, better physical infrastructure, electricity, better water systems, may be also enhancing unpaid care work sector instead of just the market sector. And then many countries that are facing low or extra low fertility are realizing that they are organizing their economies in such a way that family making is less appealing. And we can only understand that when we look at the patterns of family making on the unpaid care work side as much as on the labor market side. So what can we do about these things? We can gather more time use data. We can estimate NTA and TTA by sex, and we can embed the care economy into policy and planning frameworks and documents. And sorry, I wanted to finish like 10 minutes ago, but I just kept talking. So last thing, NTA and counting women's work contributions. Certainly understanding demographic dividends. Although I didn't really talk about this before, sustainable development goals are closely connected to many of the things measured in NTA. The UN is also exploring this beyond GDP, so trying to augment gross domestic product with other measures like the time transfer accounts, and then modeling the impacts of population aging and policy changes to address those impacts. And then finally, just highlighting life cycle perspective. So making economic demography a part of economics and policy planning overall. So I think I'm finally done talking for a little bit. I hope that you have bared with me. Here are two websites, one for the project overall and then for counting women's work. And I hope that we have a little time left for discussion. So
thank you very much.
all. Now, if I can get out of here, there we go.
Okay, thank you very much, Gretchen. What presentation. We learned a lot of knowledge today, this morning, starting from the National Transfer Account itself, the introduction to National Transfer Account and its application, which one of them would be the National Time Transfer Account. And with this time transfer account, the application is even more beyond the usual one that we know, including something that is very important, that is measuring the unpaid care work, mostly done at home. I don't know if there is unpaid that is done not at home. Anyway, so now it's time for us probably to discuss. If anybody has a question, any comment for Gretchen, feel free to ask in Bahasa Indonesia, and I will try my best to convey in English. And if you are comfortable to ask in English, please do so that we can give to Gretchen straight right away. Okay, anyone to ask a question? So if it's not anybody, so probably, oh, Ruri, please, Ruri.
Thanks, Gretchen. You mentioned that to measure, measuring the unpaid care work using market wage, it would be a poor measure because of monetary measurement that can be used instead of market wage. Thank you.
So the choice of how to impute the wage is a very sort of influential choice in what the outcome comes out to be. So using these replacement market wages, often those wages are going to be very low because they're in economic sectors that are traditionally female. And so there is sort of a long history of kind of gender segregation and gender discrimination in keeping those wages low. Now, there are other ways to try to produce these kinds of estimates, which instead of looking at this sort of labor produced, then trying to look at the product that's consumed. So how much do you spend on, say, an hour of childcare? Not how much do you pay the childcare worker, but how much does, say, the family have to pay for an hour of provided care? Or how much do you have to pay for the cooking service rather than how much does the cook earn? So that would give you a slightly higher, on average, comparing these valuations, a slightly higher total value, but that we haven't tried to pursue. A couple countries in the NTA project have tried those methods, but it's very hard to get all that data across our countries. The labor wages data is much more available. So now there's also a completely different wage imputation method, which is about the opportunity cost. So instead of valuing the time spent as what I would have to pay an average labor provider in the market, it would say valuing the time spent of the person who was doing that service. So that's sort of a different set of questions as opposed to looking at overall value to the economy. That's more sort of, why did one person decide to provide this service on an unpaid basis versus paying for that service and then spending that hour in the labor market. Those typically get you much higher overall values, but they often end up with an aggregate for unpaid care work that's, say, 2 or 3 times in some places, total GDP. And so that kind of makes people a little confused about what we're saying. Now, then there's a whole different valuation, which is to say it's really hard to cost out, say, an hour of childcare, because if you're not going to care for your children, you won't have them and you won't have the worker of the future. So, what is the value of that service? Well, I mean, you could say that it's infinite, or say, caring for an elderly person, that's about sort of maintaining a decent society and a decent quality of life. So, in some ways, this is why I often like to focus on the time results and not the monetary valuation results, because it's such a hard question, I think, to really put into a monetary unit what the value of these services are. And I went a little far afield of your question, but I hope that was at least close.
Thank you.
Okay, there is a question in chat room in Bahasa Indonesia. If we look at the time care for the elderly, would it be different if the elderly actually have a different level of health in measuring that? Thank you.
Certainly. And that is a really important question in understanding what these future patterns will look like. There are it seems like the scenario that is sort of most commonly projected into the future is that in many places, I mean, I should say the COVID pandemic notwithstanding, sort of set that aside for a moment, at least before that, much of the theorizing was that we are seeing new old cohorts who are much healthier than the cohorts that they're replacing. They enter old age in better health. But then at the same time, they sort of live longer, and so may end up with more years of disability at the end of life. And then there are also sort of unclear patterns on cognitive decline. So whether we are going to just have sort of a tidal wave of persons spending their final years with dementia, with other cognitive impairments that require a great deal of care, and not just sort of one-on-one care, but also 24-hour care. So say people who cannot be left alone. So that is a real concern, but because we are seeing healthier cohorts entering old age, it doesn't look like that's being borne out in the research that I've seen on, but I'm not a global expert on dementia care, but yeah. And with healthier persons entering old age, that sort of does argue for, say, extending retirement ages. But then we get to the point of an equity issue, sort of not everyone is going to enter old age healthy. And so is there going to be support and social protection for the elderly who are not sort of entering their silver years vibrant and able to do everything and work forever? Is there social protection for persons who can't keep working, or whose work was much more physically debilitating than someone like me who sits at a desk?
But sometimes, even though I know that the data shows the newer generation supposedly to be healthier than us, I'm wondering if there's also, of course, there's a cohort issue there. I mean, the new generation coming, say, the 90s, probably, yes, but the new generation, quote unquote, new, coming from the 60s, perhaps, because this 60s or, well, 60s growing up in the 70s, where the pollution is much higher, actually, compared to their previous generations, their predecessors. And later on, it became a little bit, well, I don't know, in some cases, probably not even get better, the pollution. It's getting worse. So we will see if it's really, even though they probably can be maintained to keep alive by all kind of technology, but as you mentioned before, the quality of life might be different. I mean, they're still alive, but they might not spend their old age in a very healthy life. Okay, any other
And I mean,
question? Oh
another
yeah,
that also, sorry, just for
yeah.
countries who have um, increased living standards quite a bit, there also often is a sort of transition in diet that
Mhm.
with income growth, you sort of solve problems of scarcity. However, you can also end up with poorer diet quality
Mhm.
than previously. So in some places there we're trading one problem
Mhm.
for a
Mhm.
different
Mhm.
problem.
Mhm.
And yeah, it sort of remains to be seen how that will net out into well-being and health in the long term. So
Mhm.
that's another good point.
Thank you. This is only to clarify. So you, the National Transfer Account network, did not collect the time use data itself. Isn't it? I mean, you just make use of what's available. Can you talk a little bit more of that?
So yes, we are data users, generally not data producers. Although
Except for
in
NTA
many
estimates.
countries, yeah, yes. So all of the time use data that I was showing you there were existing time use surveys. Now, in many countries, the national transfer accounts research groups have been important in advocating for time use data being produced. The NTA group in Kenya was very important in getting the first large national time use survey out in the field in Kenya. We hope to see results from that within the next year. In West Africa, the Counting Women's Work and National Transfer Accounts research groups were important in getting funding and advocating for putting time use modules in existing living standard surveys. So I didn't really talk about the different kinds of time use data, but there are large surveys to gather time use data that stand alone and they're very involved. They ask you to account for all of your activities sort of every 15 minutes. And then there's an elaborate coding scheme to make that data usable for researchers to compare from person to person. But there are also condensed time use surveys where you're asked to fill in what you were doing in just a sort of reduced set of activity categories. And so that's a much less expensive way to get this kind of data. And in many places, NTA research groups have been important in sort of calling for that kind of data gathering to be incorporated there. So we've been one of the many voices asking for sort of more time use data.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question on the chat room. One of the challenges of the gendered economy in developing countries such as Indonesia is the issue of the income distribution gaps between men and women. Moreover, this condition is exacerbated by the number of women working without wages for their families. What solution should government do to overcome it?
So one of the things I think that is very important, and many people who are working around unpaid care work issues are saying, is that unpaid care work is not covered by any social protection policies. So if you are a worker in many places, you earn pension credits, say, or there are laws that protect you from exploitation by your employers or harassment in a workplace. But none of these policies, by and large, cover people who do unpaid care work. So one of the important ideas with raising the visibility of unpaid care work is talking about it in terms of social protection that applies to market labor markets. And so a few countries, South Africa is one of them that has sort of pioneered this approach, is giving pension credits, public pension credits for unpaid care work in different schemes. And so that can protect mainly the women who specialize in this work when they are older and not doing it as much anymore, but perhaps aren't covered by, say, a spousal benefit, which was often the traditional sort of male breadwinner idea that many pension schemes are created around, that a wife will be covered because her husband was covered. But our families, our households are much more diverse than that. They always were, but now they're even more so. So giving pension credits themselves for unpaid care work is one way to address this. Now, the overall income distribution gaps between men and women. So there's a lot of, in the market labor, certainly there's a lot of advocacy for equal pay measures. Now, that can be very difficult because it's hard. There are very confusing discussions around sort of what's a choice and what's discrimination. So if I go out into the labor market and I look for a job, but my job has to be within an easy walk from my house because I have to go back and take care of my kids. It has to be very flexible because I have to be able to respond instantly to needs in my household, or it has to be part-time because I'm also doing all these other activities. Then my market job search is circumscribed, say, compared to if I have a male partner who doesn't have any of those concerns because I'm taking care of them. So that's an issue of, it might look like choice between my male partner and me, but it's choice under a constraint, which may not be an efficient way to allocate our productive resources at all. So it's very difficult to say that we should make laws about that because it is a choice issue. But I think that at least people like me can just keep on sort of showing the data and making arguments about sort of the efficiency of allocating our productive resources, and that it's inefficient when it's too strictly gendered, and also that that when the outside conditions that contribute to the gender economy begin to fall away. So fertility reduces. That means I don't have the childcare burdens that, say, my grandmother has. Educational attainment equalizes. So I don't have the disadvantage in the labor market that my grandmother had compared to her male peers. So if all those things are going away and I still am not earning as much as then, that's the gendered economy being much stickier than other aspects of the economy. And that argues for more regulation and a more closer eye on those differences.
Thank you. It's really interesting that you mentioned South African scheme to provide the pension for unpaid workers. But how about other social protection? For instance, like the protection from accident, protection from, say, health and everything, unless they're already covered by the national health SIM itself. So
I'm not really an expert in those areas, other than to say that overall, the principle of valuing unpaid care work as work should apply. That being aware of unpaid care work as work, just as valuable, just as important, and just as worthy of protection as any sort of market work, should motivate regulation. But I don't know what those regulations would look like, and they're really difficult to make workable. But that's also because there is a mental block at the household door in how we think about sort of government's role. And certainly I don't want the government in my household all the time, but I also don't want to just assume that there's no place for the law sort of behind that household door.
Thank you. That's actually one of the advantage of well, many advantages of NTA, isn't it? That we actually take into account also the different in organization of the countries, the social organization, the economic systems, and beside the level of development, of course, but those are also that is already structural in the countries should be taken account to. I saw Elder.
I mean, certainly I wouldn't, just sorry
Mm,
to interrupt, but
sorry.
yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the message of counting women's work or time transfer accounts that unpaid care work is only a burden and no one wants to do it and
Mm,
it's something that we should just try to eliminate if at all. I mean, it's not about that. It's more about a more equal distribution of these services and a more careful eye to whether we are using our time productively or whether those sticky cultural institutions around what women can do and what men can do are sort of making us waste our time. We want to spend our time on those high value activities, the real caring infrastructure that creates societal well-being, not just sort of spending time sweeping the same floor 20 times because I'm not allowed to do anything else.
mm. Yes. Thank you. Elder, I saw that you opened your camera. Are you ready to?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Thank you, Katuro. Hello, Gretchen. My name is Elda. I am one of the lecturers in this study program. So thank you for your exciting topic. And I just wonder about the applicability of the method. For instance, I was thinking like during the pandemic, parents also play a role as teachers. So it's not just caring, but also educating the children. And also in relation to this, as a university teacher myself, I thought that in Indonesia, people don't value the time teachers spend to prepare for the materials, for the study materials, and usually teachers work more than the normal hours because they grade, they prepare, they pay attention to their students, they spend more time. So I'm just interested whether you can use this for that type of occupation. So just like teachers and those people in the service sector that work more in their occupation, because it is also care, like taking care of the society. So what is your opinion about that, Gretchen? Thank you.
That's a great comment. And I think, I mean, not to say that sort of there were good outcomes from the pandemic, because I certainly would rather have it never have happened. But the experience of so many places where very rapidly thousands of hours of market-based care provided to school children went away and went back into households, that really, I think, highlighted how much that work, how much effort it requires and how valuable it is to the students and to the parents who are able to spend their time on market labor when their kids are in school. So unfortunately, I mean, I'm not really sure how that debate kind of went in Indonesia, but certainly in the United States, for a while schools were closed and while all this upheaval was going on, there was a great reckoning with the value of caring occupations and the need to make care jobs better jobs, because everybody saw what it was like to have to do them all the time. But that realization didn't last. And a big President Biden's Build Back Better package of government programs to sort of rebuild the economy after COVID. Initially, a lot of the discussion around that, many people were calling it a more care, less carbon sort of package, that it was going to have a lot of childcare investment and a lot of care economy investment and a lot of investment to address climate change. So the idea of more care, less carbon was very compelling, but in the final analysis, all that got passed was the less carbon part. The more care part did not get passed at all. And so, like I said, I don't know if any sort of similar dynamics happened in Indonesia, but the sort of importance of the care economy got a lot of play early on in the pandemic, but then people were very happy to just ignore it again. So I think that speaks to the need to keep bringing up these research topics, the research results, the importance of making all of this work visible, continuing on.
Thank you,
That was a
Gretchen.
long answer to a
Thank
good
you,
question.
Gretchen. Yeah, I know. It's just I think here, is it okay if I continue?
Sure. Just
Yeah,
for a
it's
short
just-
time though.
Yeah, it is just here that people say that teachers are underpaid, and now that parents realize that the value of the work done by educators. Another issue. I hope we have time to discuss it a little bit. You said that the approach of NTA is individual based, right? And I wonder how much the interplay between household members can be incorporated in the way you calculate it, because in Indonesia particularly, we have extended family, for instance. The care in the household could be shared with your cousins, your aunties, and so on. So it would be very interesting if we can kind of incorporate this thing in the calculation of unpaid care work. Thank you.
So that is definitely a big part of the calculations, both of sort of market consumption on the NTA side and also unpaid care work consumption, is looking at the data that we get on total household amounts, say total household income, total household expenditure, total household sort of care produced, and then based on the household structure, using numeric methods to estimate who consumes what. So we definitely have that in national transfer accounts as part of our way to estimate our age profiles. We have some work that we've done because this involves a big matrix of sort of who has resources and they give that resource to whom, to someone else. So trying to figure out what the age, sex group, what the transfers are sort of from persons by age and sex to persons by age and sex, which creates a whole matrix of transfers. Now, that's all done based on what we understand about household structure. So resources and services that go across household borders are much harder for us to sort of guess at. So the transfers of market goods and services and care within a household, we can take pretty decent guesses at that. Right next door, if my parents are living next door, it's a lot harder in just the data that we have available to sort of figure out those transfers very well. We try, but they always come out as so tiny that I suspect there's a lot that we're sort of missing in measurement. And so that but that demands a much more micro sort of, I'd need to put somebody on the porch and just spying on everyone to figure out what all the transfers are.
Okay.
So I think that we do a pretty good job understanding household structure dynamics, but not sort of transfers across households.
Thank you. So it would be an interesting research as well, right, for the students if they are interested in it. Thank you, Gretchen.
And sit on the porch.
Yes.
Well, the main issue will be in data. Yeah. So long as we have the data, actually, especially for the household transfers, that probably can be taken care of, but collecting that kind of data will be very tedious. But in general, I see that if it's really accepted, the national transfer account and the derivative, the national time transfer account, together with the other one that is more into the green economy account, those two will really very complementary to the current national account that we know as of today, that put more on the market, put more on the today rather than in the future, and also put more on the traditional, I might say traditional economy, what we understood as economy. But with the addition of these two, the national transfer account that take into account the age, the sex, and then somebody I'm sure already come up with that green account, then we will have much better understanding about the economy and the social organization that we work on, and also in terms of sustainability, we will be able to say something about that. Okay, last question, Gretchen. Where will the NTA go from here?
That is a big question. Well, I think that our traditional focus and strength in economic demography is always going to be the sort of number one contribution that we have. And I think that is more important now than ever. Each successive set of UN population projections pushes the date at which it is estimated that global population will peak and then decline a little bit further. So fertility remains low, lower than expectations. It often falls faster than was expected. Not in every region, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, many people thought that fertility would be lower than it is by now. But overall, at the global level, we are sort of looking at having to completely reimagine economies and what we understand as economic growth without population growth. So I think that in order to do that, we have to understand our generational economy. So I think that will always be the big strength of NTA, that it's providing the understanding of our generational economy that we have to start imagining a different way to organize our economies to maintain living standards and well-being. I think the other thing that we can do is, along with so many others in the data science, social science space, is to continue to get better at disaggregating. So, when I started off showing those global GDP or national level GDP, and then down to per capita and down to per capita by age and sex. And so disaggregation is the name of the game, and the way that we can continue to contribute to understanding how to build economies that are sustainable and that are maximizing well-being and a good life for as many people as possible.
That's great. As far as now, as I know, that one area that seems to be a little bit like stop is the inequality. Once those Brazilians kind of doing something else, it does not seem to be a lot of work in area of inequality and NTA. And I'm surely would like to see more of that, because, especially in countries like Indonesia, where inequality and poverty are still two issues that are important for the countries. It's probably where the NTA can also contribute to it. And also, of course, those countries in Africa and Asia that are still developing. Okay, thank you. Last message, perhaps last words from Gretchen?
Thank you for your interest in economic demography, and I hope it continues, everyone. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much again for Gretchen. So let's give round applause to Gretchen. Just click reaction and then there is. Thank you. And I hope this presentation is not just like this, but it actually puts I hope it will be like putting seeds on people's mind that, oh, there are research out there that go to this direction, and it's probably should be adding something to that research already, and probably some of the students are interested to write on that. That will be great, and the NTA will still growing at this moment, so there's always room for improvement. There's always room to add knowledge in this area. Again, thank you very much, Gretchen. Buri, you want to say something?
No, it's a very excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and thanks so much for giving the guest lecture for us, Gretchen. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you
Pleasure.
for everyone
you.
who attended this guest lecture. So probably like most things or most webinar in Indonesia, the last important thing is taking pictures, making sure that is documented. So anybody, please turn on your camera, especially since you already downloaded the background. So why don't we make use of it so that in the picture there's this background. In the program, is there anybody in the program who would take picture? If not, then I have to
You want
prepare. Yeah, you can.
I can do it.
Okay.
1 second.
Ready? Okay. 1, 2. Okay. Second, let me check if it's again. Okay, looks good. Okay, for me it's done. Wait. Oh, I only took the first page. I forgot that this thing has many page. Okay, second. So let me second. 1, 2. Oh, there's no one smiling in this second one. Okay. Thank you very much again, Gretchen. So hope to see you again anytime soon. And again, thank you for everyone. Hope to see you in the next guest lecture. Thank you. Good evening and good morning for everyone. Have a nice